Hello, my name is Kathrine Mortimore and I'm one of Neil Bowen's writers on the Art of Poetry series. This video particularly focuses on War Photographer, but if you need any help with any of the other poems, then Neil Bowen and I are both on Twitter. Neil in particular shares lots of extracts and essays about the poems, but feel free to contact him if there's anything in particular that you're struggling with and you need help with, and he'll be more than happy to help you out. So as I say, we started with War Photographer, and I've got a picture there of Duffy looking very glamorous because it's from the 80s. She actually wrote War Photographer in 1985, so 35 years ago. And what's really striking is to think about how ahead of her time she was with her thinking and how relevant a lot of her ideas are today. In fact, they're so relevant that we can be forgiven for thinking that she wrote the poem relatively recently. So Caroline Duffy gained a lot of inspiration for her poetry from her friendship with two war photographers. So we have Philip James Griffiths there and Don McCallum. And I really like to think about Caroline Duffy spending a lot of time over a glass of wine, perhaps, discussing with these war photographers their experiences and their frustrations in the length of time that they spend out in these war zones, the trauma that they go through themselves and what they witness within other people, and how they capture images of those and the moral dilemma that they go through when they capture those images, only to come home and have their editors flick through all of the hundreds of agonies, as she puts in her poem, from which the editor will pick out 5 or 6. And not only does the editor show this careless attitude, but the reader themselves may well be moved for a period, but then they'll move on very quickly with the rest of their day. So I thought I'd show you a couple of the sorts of photographs that have opened up this debate that Caroline Duffy is referring to, and I think this is quite clearly a demonstration of the spools of suffering that she's referring to here. This entire community obviously devastated, and that moment captured for eternity. And this image as well, the war photographer has actually written extensively about this experience and how shocked he and multiple people took similar images of this gentleman. This is the last moments of his life, but that's not what he was expecting when he had the camera at the ready. The people waved guns around all of the time in these different contexts, and it was a real shock when he actually pulled the trigger. And so ultimately what he's ended up capturing, as I say, is the very last moments of this man's life. And the ethical debate around that and the consent, obviously that man has not in a position to give his consent for his image to be shared multiple times across different media platforms, different media organisations, and the profit and the money that's made out of that, as I say, is the ethical debate that's at the core of War Photographer and the exploitation ultimately of those people suffering. Okay, so this is the first stanza, and I'm just going to read it out so that we get a sense of the tone and the atmosphere at the start of the poem. In his dark room he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. So there's a real sense of irony that's established with this initial pronoun here, in his dark room. We're witnessing the photographer himself. We're observing, and we're encouraged to observe this intimate moment when the photographer spends his days, his time observing other people. So there's an irony in the inversion of that. So the camera has, instead of the war photographer holding the camera and pointing it outwards, we now are encouraged to put the spotlight and put the observation onto him. And as I say, it's an intimate moment. This finally alone gives this sense that he's been waiting for this opportunity to close the door and be and have this private experience in this moment of catharsis. So catharsis is an emotional release. And we get a real sense that within this dark room, this war photographer has been waiting to get within his dark room so that he can process the trauma that he's experienced, so that he can come to terms with it, so that his mind can turn inwards. And just as he is processing the physical photographs, he's also processing his psychological trauma and attempting to find some resolution. So we've got the spools of suffering being set out, and there's a sibilance there with the repeated S sounds, which we could argue gives a sense of disgust, either from the war photographer or perhaps we're encouraged to have this sense of disgust at these spools of suffering and the juxtaposition and the contrast between the spools of suffering and the ordered rows, and the attempt that the photographer is attempting to make out of the chaos that he's experienced and people have experienced. It's probably important to point out to a modern reader that this is pre-digital. So when I grew up, you had a camera with a film within it, like a roll, and you would send it off to be developed. And this spool is the reel of negatives, of images that he's taken out of the camera. So we end the stanza with this real series of fragmented sentences. So Belfast, Beirut, Panom Fem. It almost feels like a stream of consciousness. It's like it's involuntarily imprinting itself once again within his mind. We've got a series of flashes, perhaps a series of flashes of images within his mind, just like the camera flash as he took the images at the time. They're flashing back again through his mind, and it's almost like the camera has imprinted these memories onto his soul. We'll talk about the religious and the spiritual connection in a moment, because that's reinforced with this final line, all flesh is grass. So not only does that word flesh link to the nakedness, and there are multiple examples of war photography which literally demonstrate that people's nakedness, and that's been captured and consumed by the global community. But also this idea of being exposed, so flesh in a metaphorical sense of exposure, overwhelming indignity of those moments of suffering and the worst moments of those people's lives being laid bare within the photograph. All flesh is grass is also a biblical phrase which relates to the transitory nature of life, and what that means is that that life will never last. Our flesh is literally us being alive, and it literally then, with our death, goes into the ground and becomes one with nature. And the grass is representative of how nature grows from literally our dead flesh, which is not a pleasant image at all, and that reinforces the multiple bodies that are within the ground, that are again within images of the war photographers take of multiple death within these horrific environments. The fact that it's a biblical phrase also reinforces that spiritual tone that's connects lots of those phrases within that first stanza. And it sets up this sense of ritual, where, as we said, he's finally alone at the beginning of the stanza. He's finally alone to carry out this ritual of processing both the photographs, literally and metaphorically processing his trauma and attempting to come to terms with that trauma, and if we think about that final couple of words at the very end of the poem, "No one cares," it's quite clear that the war photographer is unable to come to terms with what he's doing as a result of this process. Okay, so I hope that's been helpful. As I say, obviously the whole essay on all of the poems in the anthology is within the book, and doesn't matter what exam board you're studying, there will be an anthology on there for the art of poetry. So as I said at the beginning, please contact Neil Bowen, myself on Twitter. The links to that is at the bottom of the YouTube video. If there's any poem both within this anthology or perhaps with a different exam board, and I'm sure Neil will see what he can do to help you out if you're unable to get hold of a copy of the book. Thank you very much for listening.